Hello and welcome to Papa Tom's Take. The title of the podcast today is P47. Has it really only been 2 weeks? Um, I wasn't really going to record something this soon. I was going to wait for a month, but there's been so much going on. And in fact, I heard from one of my friends basically asking me to do a podcast. Um, I would like to touch on two things really quick, and then I'm going to talk about four things in more detail, things that have happened in the first 2 weeks. The first one is curious to me. Um, P47 pardoned a lot of the people associated with January 6th, but one person, what maybe several, but one person stood out to me, Stuart Rhodes, who's I think he's an oath keeper. Not sure. That's easy to find out. However, he was not pardoned. His sentence was commuted. Now, I did a little research, and commuting a sentence simply means that the conviction stands, but that you shorten the time of the jail time or whatever the penalty is. So, in my mind, that's an acknowledgement by P47's administration that, in fact, there was a there, because if the conviction stands, he was convicted for something associated with January 6th. So all this talk about January 6th not happening or being a peaceful demonstration or whatever, that commutation kind of belies that. I find that curious. I also find it interesting that as far as I know, the media hasn't picked up on that. And the other thing I'd like to comment on, I mean, there's so many things that could talk about the Treasury Department giving their system over to the non-existent Department of Government Efficiency and deporting people from churches and schools. I mean, there's so much there. But the other thing I want to briefly touch on, because I think my take is a little different here, and I've looked for the email that federal government workers got, and I can't find it, so I don't know the exact wording. But federal government employees were given some kind of option to resign effective sometime in September, and during that time, they would receive, between now and then, they would receive their normal benefits and so on. And I think there was probably a wink and a nod that, and during that time, you won't have to do so much. So at first, I thought, well, that's a way of reducing the size of the government workforce and maybe increasing efficiency so the dead wood would leave. But as I thought about it more, my take on it is to think about the organizations you've been associated with. If that kind of offer came to fellow employees or people that reported to you or something, I think that the people that would take you up on it were the young, very attuned people with current work capabilities and so on, because their notion was they could move from the federal government to maybe a state government or from the federal government to private sector. The people that are going to stay and hunker down are the ones whose skill set is outdated, because their prospect for finding something else is much less than the hot shots. So that's simply a different take. Clearly, it'll be a blend of that. Deadwood leaving or the shining stars leaving. But I don't think it's going to necessarily accomplish what it was intent to accomplish. I don't have the numbers in front of me, and we'll talk about some other time. But in fact, the size of the number of employees in the federal government has decreased from, say, the 1970s till today. And off the top of my head, in the 70s, there were 2.9 million, and today there are 2.3 million. So again, my take on that is that since clearly the government hasn't gotten smaller with fewer programs or anything, so you have fewer people doing more things. So by definition, that seems to be more efficient to me. So anyway, That's just, I rambled on about that longer than I wanted to. First thing I'm going to focus on this morning is Bishop Budd's homily at the National Prayer Service on January 21st. As you know, this is a tradition the day after inauguration, the president and family and high-ranking officials go to the National Cathedral, and it's a day of unity in the location of the National Cathedral. And in fact, I went back, I listened to her homily at the time, and I went back and listened to it. And most of her message was around the notion of unity. And she built that message on what she called three principles, Christian principles, that would support unity. And she recognized that in a political system, unity doesn't necessarily mean that everybody gets what they want, or it doesn't mean that there's not compromise. And she recognized that there are different views, but that you need to be respectful of the other views. So anyway, her call for unity was based on three principles: honoring human dignity, honesty, and humility. And then she talked about that for a while. And then at the end of her message, she talked about mercy to the people who are in the nation who are frightened because they are in minority groups, undocumented aliens, LGBTQ community, and people of color could be feeling some fear now. So she asked for mercy. And one of the things she said that struck me was that God never, and she said based on Scripture, she draws the conclusion that God is never impressed with prayers when actions are not informed by them. I thought that was an interesting message, because today we hear so much about prayers, and it seems like prayers have to be coupled with action. Now, here is exactly word for word, although I'm going to bleep out a little bit, P47's response to in writing on X to the service. And I quote, "She brought her church into the world of politics in a very ungracious way. She was nasty in tone and not compelling or smart. She failed to mention," and then he goes on to talk about his normal kind of campaign things about illegal aliens and emptying jails and mental institutions and so on. But then he comes back. "Apart from her inappropriate statements, the service was very boring and uninspiring one. She is not very good at her job. She and her church owes the public an apology." There was nothing about her message that wouldn't be part of a service on any Sunday, except that the part where she was really talking to directly the members of the administration who were in attendance, asking for mercy. One of the main themes of the New Testament is mercy and peace and love. I posted something about this on Facebook, and someone responded by saying it was not appropriate time or place. And I pointed out that Jesus, in fact, spoke to power and basically, in some ways, made a political statement in the temple. And you can find that in the scriptures if you're interested. So he didn't take to heart. He wasn't at all moved by this message, this plea for Christian mercy. The next topic that I want to touch on is this whole notion of the attack on birthright citizenship, 14th Amendment. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment has other verbiage, but the key part of it is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and are are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any laws which shall bridge the privilege or immunities of citizenship of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any of the persons within its jurisdiction equal protection under the law. Then Section 5 basically says Congress needs to enforce this. It's very clear. It's in the Constitution, and the Constitution can be amended through a process. And I'm not going to go through that process today. You can look that up, or you can look that up. And it's not by executive order. So an executive order cannot eliminate birthright citizenship. The lawsuit, the argument that P47's administration seems to be making is on this phrase that says subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And I think what they're basically saying is that an illegal alien or illegal alien has broken the law, and so they're not subject to the jurisdiction. I'm not sure. I did some research, and the original intent of that phrase was twofold. First of all, to eliminate children of diplomats from having U.S. citizenship. And the second was, at the time that this was written, the Native Americans were viewed as a sovereign nation, and that it was to eliminate them from the possibility. So then I wondered, why is this such a big deal at this time for P47's administration? And then I made the connection. If during mass deportation they grab convicted criminals, I think that would get general support from the American public. I, for one, would support that if they've been convicted of a crime. But then that only accounts for, depending upon the numbers you get, about 450,000 convicted and about 600 and some thousand charged. So if you take those two together, that's 1 million. But P47 has strongly implied that the plan is to mass deport 11 to 20 million undocumented people. In order to do that, there's going to be cases where a mother and father came into this country illegally, a misdemeanor, by the way, not a felony, misdemeanor. And then they had children, 3 children. Those children under birthright citizenship are American citizens. And if the mass deportation gathers up the mother and father, extreme case, the father works construction and the mother works in maintenance at a hospital, never broken any laws, are good neighbors, and so on. If the ICE comes in and grabs the mom and dad with the idea of deporting them, there are 3 American citizens there who, if they're deported with the family, I think that would raise not only a legal issue, but I think the American people would say, wait a minute, you can't separate the family and you can't do this to American citizens. So if P47 eliminates birthright citizenship, those 3 children aren't citizens. And so there wouldn't be the legal and or public outcry about that. So that's my take. Um, that's my take on why he's made this attack. Now, it's clear to me, as I said, that there's a process for amending the Constitution. And this is one example where I think P47, instead of upholding the Constitution, would just as soon ignore it. If this works through the court and it gets all the way to the Supreme Court and the Supremes side with P47, I think that's a sign that this country and the Constitution is no longer, this country's in trouble, and the Constitution is no longer a document that forms the foundation of the rule of law. And speaking about the rule of law brings me to my next topic. P47 fired, or tried to fire, because I think that there's still an issue, but let's say fired. P47 fired approximately 18 inspector generals from different departments in the government. Now, I'm not going to read all the details, but the Inspector General Act of 1978 and the Inspector Reform Act of 2008 established that before an Inspector General could be fired, Congress had to be given 30 days notice. Clearly, in my unprofessional view, P47 violated that. So we have him stepping on the Constitution and violating the rule of law. Just real quick, inspector generals, I did a quick search, and I'm not going to read all of this. The Inspector General office was established as an independent oversight, and their role is preventing and detecting fraud, waste, and abuse. That sounds like that would play very well into the desire of P47 to make the government more efficient and smaller, to promote efficiency and effectiveness. Well, that's right in their wheelhouse. To ensure compliance with laws and regulations, to report to Congress and agency heads, and to protect whistleblowers. All that seems like a good thing. They're protected by the Inspector Reform Act of 2008 in Section 3 with this need to have Congress notified in 30 days. Now, I got to tell you, I don't have a whole lot of faith in Congress. And so I'm guessing that in 30 days, the Republican majority would simply rubber stamp all those firings. So I'm not naive about that. But the fact is, P47 stepping on the Constitution and ignoring the rule of law. These are two very clear examples. Which brings me to the last topic that I'm going to cover in some detail. And this discussion's for you, Dave. Dave contacted me and essentially asked me to do this. And he made a great suggestion to me. What we're going to talk about was P47's initial comments to the country regarding the crash between an American Airlines jet and a military helicopter. Now, just to set the stage, Dave suggested that I go back and look at some previous examples of the President of the United States consoling or comforting and supporting a people. So I looked at several with natural disasters, and that's a little different. I mean, well, you'll see why. But then I found George W. Bush's comments the evening after 9/11, the evening of 9/11. And he spoke for less than but close to 5 minutes. And his message that night was comfort for the people who were grieving, recognition of the activities of first responders, a promise to get to the bottom of who was involved in this, and then a promise to pursue them for justice, and assurance of the people of the country that the financial stability of the country was good, the security of the country was on high alert, so that it was a reassuring message. So that four and a half, say 5 minute message was, in my mind, exactly right on. And I lived through that. I remember having email and phone conversations with family and friends, and the country needed to hear that. So contrast that to approximately 12 hours after the crash. P-47 delivered a message and then took questions. And I couldn't get a time on when he was speaking, because during that, he also had some other officials speaking, including the vice president. His message started, well, first of all, I need to respond. A Facebook friend of mine said, well, he has a lot more information than you. Well, 12 hours after the crash, yes, he had more information than the public, but he didn't have a detailed investigation of what was going on. So close your eyes for a second. No, don't close your eyes, just imagine. As you first heard that information, that breaking news that a military helicopter had crashed into a airline flight in midair, think about your first three responses. Maybe your response was shock. Maybe your response was feeling grieved for the people whose lives were lost. Maybe you even said a silent prayer for their souls and their families. You might have thought about the impact on a future flight that you were going to take. You might have worried if it was a terrorist attack. But I suspect that way, 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 way down the list was thinking, whose fault was it? Where's the blame lie? Let's look at what P-47 did. He started with asking for a moment of silence. Then he gave the facts about what happened. Then he did provide for several minutes words of comfort for the nation, recognition of the grief that families are feeling, a sadness at the loss of life. He recognized the first responders, and he did pledge an investigation. So I think at that point he was spot on. But then, and I timed this, at 5:01 in his presentation to the American people, he switched into campaign mode, and he very quickly moved into the notion of blame. Now, keep in mind, about 12 hours after the fight, the flight recorders hadn't been retrieved. They were still in a search and rescue mode. The recordings between the pilots and the tower were probably available, but you'll see in a second the probably that I'm going to put there. But he quickly jumped to blame. And who did he blame? The evils that he perceived from the campaign trail. One of the boogeymen for this campaign was DEI. And there was an interview where he was asked what DEI was. He really couldn't even explain it. But he blamed DEI for so that if you, in a sense, because of that, he was, without evidence, blaming the air traffic controllers. He didn't know how many there were. He probably didn't know at that point that the tower was understaffed. Anyway, he probably had sketchy information, but not a detailed investigation, but yet jumped to the conclusion that it was DEI that that caused it. And then, interestingly enough, he pivoted to blaming the military pilots of the aircraft. Now, stop and think about this. Here you have a tragedy that happened. People have been informed that their loved ones are lost, and the President of the United States focuses on blame, and he even points out your son or daughter who's the pilot of the helicopter who caused this flight. Or maybe it was your husband or wife who was in the control tower who caused this terrible tragedy. Now, that in the end, there'll be an investigation. And even though I hate to use the word blame, there will be blame placed in some location. Now, fast forward to 3 days after the tragedy, and listen to a long discussion of where the investigation was. And at that point, 3 days afterwards, there was still some conflicting data on how high what altitude the helicopter pilot was flying. And in the end, that might be the answer, that the helicopter crew was at an altitude that was inappropriate. But even now, it's too early to say that. But 3 days later, there was not conclusive evidence that was true. And 3 days later, they were still trying to retrieve all of the communications between the pilot of the helicopter and the tower. So P-47 could not have had definitive information to blame. As it turns out, it's not clear whether I couldn't find who were the specific air traffic controllers. From listening to the conversations, they sound male. I have no idea about their race or their physical disabilities, but the helicopter crew was 2 males and a female, all of whom had lots of experience in going through training and were very competent. It's interesting that the female pilot's family asked the Army to withhold her name for some time because of the president's charges of DEI being the culprit in this crash. So where are we? I think that the first instance, the two topics in the center basically show that P-47 really doesn't care about the Constitution, and that P-47 doesn't really care about the rule of law because of ignoring the notification that was necessary for Congress. So those are just 2 examples. There are other examples in this first 2 weeks. And the first topic, his feud with Bishop Budd and his comments on that day, show that there really is something lacking in this man's character. In response to a question from a reporter at the news conference on how did he know that DEI was the culprit for this, his answer was, because I have common sense. Let that sink in for a second. Common sense would not lead someone automatically to a conclusion that DEI was to blame for this crash. Now, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's say P-47 has common sense. But I think the first issue with Bishop Budd and the way he handled that initial discussion of related to the terrible crash, he might have common sense. I doubt that, but he might have common sense. But what those 2 episodes clearly show is that he is lacking in human decency. He's lacking in human decency. Now, I said that I will close these podcasts with a quote. So the quotation I have today, which kind of relates to what we've talked about here at the very end, comes from President/General Dwight Eisenhower. He says, "The search for a scapegoat is the easiest of all hunting expeditions." So P-47 immediately went to the blame game because he was, I guess, fearful that someone somehow would blame his administration. Thank you for watching this podcast, and I hope that you'll search for future podcasts.